It was an ordinary day, yet for Stephen, everything about it felt heavy. He was a man who had long since lost his ability to find joy in life, weighed down by the death of his father many years ago. The tragedy had left a permanent mark on his soul. A void had formed where his trust and belief in happiness once existed. He kept his life simple, dedicated to his work in the Philippines, thinking that keeping himself busy would protect him from further pain. But on this day, as he stood by the waterfront of Manila Bay, reflecting on the years of his emotional isolation, someone changed everything. Cecile entered his life quietly, without warning, as though fate had conspired to place her there at just the right moment. Cecile was different. Her beauty wasn't just external, it radiated from within. There was a sadness in her eyes that mirrored Stephen's own. She stood a few feet away, looking out at the horizon, her hands clutched tightly around a delicate silver locket that hung from her neck, a keepsake from her past, a memory of the fiancé she had lost years ago. The love of her life, gone in a sudden and tragic accident, leaving her shattered but somehow still standing. Stephen noticed her quiet contemplation and found himself inexplicably drawn to her. Her presence stirred something within him, an urge to speak to her, though he hadn't felt that way in a long time. He hesitated, unsure of what to say, but before he could overthink it, their eyes met. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Stephen began awkwardly, trying to mask the emotions bubbling under the surface. Cecile looked up, her expression soft but distant. She offered a faint smile, one tinged with sorrow. "It is, but sometimes beauty feels bittersweet." Her words struck Stephen deeper than he expected. He nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. Without thinking, he responded, "You've lost someone too, haven't you?" Cecile's eyes flickered with surprise. She hadn't expected such a direct question from a stranger, but there was a strange comfort in his candidness. "Yes," she replied quietly. "Someone I loved very much." For a brief moment, they stood in silence, connected by an invisible thread of shared pain. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt uncomfortable, but rather the kind that allowed two souls to recognize the scars of the other. "I lost my father," Stephen finally said, breaking the silence. "He was taken from me, and ever since then, it's been hard to trust that anything good lasts." Cecile's eyes softened. She knew that feeling all too well. It's hard to believe in forever after losing someone you thought would be by your side forever. Their brief conversation that day ended with a quiet goodbye, both of them parting ways without exchanging numbers or making plans to meet again. But even though they walked away from each other, something had shifted. Stephen couldn't stop thinking about Cecile, her gentle voice, her deep sadness, her strength despite everything. Little did he know, Cecile couldn't stop thinking about him either. Fate is a curious thing. Days after their brief but profound meeting, Stephen and Cecile crossed paths again, this time at a small, intimate cafe nestled in the heart of the city. Stephen had been meeting a friend for coffee, and Cecile happened to be there with a mutual acquaintance. The universe seemed determined to bring them together. As they sat at neighboring tables, their eyes met once again, and the quiet recognition between them was unmistakable. Stephen's heart skipped a beat as he wondered whether he should say something, but Cecile beat him to it this time. "It seems we keep running into each other," Cecile said with a light smile, her tone friendlier than before. Stephen chuckled softly, feeling his nerves ease at her warmth. Maybe it's fate trying to tell us something. Their conversation, which started casually, quickly turned more personal. They spoke about their families, their work, their routines, but all of it felt like a prelude to deeper discussions. As they sipped their coffee, the two of them found themselves sharing more about their lives than they had with anyone in years. Cecile spoke about her fiancé, Mark. They had been inseparable, planning their future together, building dreams of a family and a lifetime of love. But it all came crashing down one night when Mark was involved in a fatal car accident. Cecile was left devastated, her world shattered in an instant. Ever since then, she had carried the weight of that loss, unsure if she would ever be able to love again. Stephen listened intently, his heart aching for her. He could see the pain etched in her every word, and yet there was something about her resilience that struck him. Despite everything, she hadn't closed herself off completely. There was still a light in her that refused to be extinguished. "It's hard to move on," Stephen said quietly, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup. "After my father died, I pushed everyone away. It felt easier that way, less risky." Cecile nodded, understanding all too well. Sometimes it feels like the only way to protect yourself, but it can also make life feel empty. Her words hung in the air, resonating with Stephen more than he cared to admit. For years, he had lived his life in a state of emotional detachment, afraid to let anyone get close enough to hurt him again. But sitting there with Cecile, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something more, something worth risking the pain for. As the evening went on, they continued talking, laughing occasionally, and sharing stories about their lives. By the time they left the cafe, they had exchanged phone numbers, promising to keep in touch. That night, as Stephen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he felt a glimmer of hope, something he hadn't felt in years. Cecile had awoken something inside him, something he wasn't sure he was ready to confront yet. But one thing was clear: she had become more than just a passing acquaintance. She was someone he couldn't forget. And Cecile, lying awake in her own bed, felt the same. Days turned into weeks, and Stephen and Cecile grew closer with every passing day. They began spending more time together, meeting for coffee, taking walks along the bay, and talking late into the night on the phone. There was an ease to their relationship that felt natural, almost as if they had known each other for years instead of just a few weeks. Despite the growing connection between them, both Stephen and Cecile were cautious. Their shared history of loss made them wary of falling too fast or too hard. But even as they tried to protect themselves, their hearts couldn't help but open to one another. One evening, as the sun began to set, Stephen and Cecile found themselves sitting by the water, watching the golden hues of the sunset reflect off the waves. The air was warm, and the sound of the ocean was soothing, creating the perfect backdrop for the conversation that was about to unfold. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Cecile admitted softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Stephen turned to look at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What way?" Cecile hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Hopeful. Like maybe there's still something good left for me in this world." Stephen's breath caught in his throat. He had been feeling the same way, but hearing Cecile say it out loud made it real. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "After everything that's happened, I didn't think I could ever trust anyone again. But with you, it feels different." Cecile turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Different how?" Stephen took a deep breath, his heart racing. "Like maybe it's worth the risk this time." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of Stephen's words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Cecile's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had been afraid of letting herself feel anything for Stephen, afraid of opening her heart again. But in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be afraid anymore. Slowly, Stephen reached out and took Cecile's hand in his. The touch was gentle, tentative, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through Cecile's body. She looked down at their joined hands, her heart swelling with emotion. "Cecile," Stephen said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's going to happen between us, but I do know that I want to find out." Cecile felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been so afraid of letting herself feel anything for Stephen, afraid of losing him the way she had lost Mark. But in that moment, as she looked into Stephen's eyes, she realized that maybe it was worth the risk. "I do too," she whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. Stephen smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up his entire face. And in that moment, Cecile knew that she had found something worth holding on to. From that day forward, Stephen and Cecile's relationship deepened. They spent nearly every day together, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. There was a sense of joy and lightness that permeated their time together, as if they were both rediscovering what it meant to be truly happy. For Stephen, being with Cecile felt like coming up for air after years of drowning in sorrow. He hadn't realized just how much he had been holding back, how much he had closed himself off from the world, until Cecile came into his life. With her, he felt alive again, as though the weight of his father's death had been lifted from his shoulders. Cecile, too, found healing in their relationship. For so long, she had been living in the shadow of her past, unable to move on from the loss of her fiancé. But with Stephen, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in years. He made her believe that it was possible to love again, that it was okay to let herself be happy. One evening, as they sat together on Cecile's porch, watching the stars twinkle overhead, Stephen turned to Cecile with a serious expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, his voice thoughtful, "about us." Cecile's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this conversation, knowing that it was only a matter of time before they had to talk about where their relationship was headed. Stephen continued, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I know we've both been through a lot, and I know that things haven't been easy for either of us. But I don't want to lose what we have." Cecile swallowed hard, her emotions swirling inside her. "I don't want to lose it either." Stephen turned to look at her, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I want us to build something together, something real. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I want you in it." Tears welled up in Cecile's eyes as she listened to Stephen's words. It was everything she had hoped for, everything she had been too afraid to admit she wanted. "I want that too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to build a future with you." In that moment, as they held each other close under the stars, Stephen and Cecile knew that they had found something special. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real, and that was all they needed. Stephen and Cecile's relationship had flourished in ways neither of them could have anticipated. They had grown comfortable in each other's presence, finding solace in their shared moments. However, despite their deepening bond, both knew they were still haunted by the specters of their pasts. And these ghosts would not disappear quietly. One evening, Cecile received a call from her childhood friend Mia, who had been with her through the darkest days following Mark's tragic death. Mia had always been Cecile's rock, and their conversation quickly turned to how Cecile was doing in her relationship with Stephen. "Do you think you're really ready to move on?" Mia asked cautiously over the phone, her concern palpable. Cecile hesitated. She hadn't allowed herself to think too deeply about whether she had fully healed from the loss of Mark. While Stephen brought her immense joy, a part of her still clung to the memory of her late fiancé. The love she had promised would last forever. The guilt of loving someone else was a weight she hadn't yet let go of. I don't know," Cecile finally admitted, her voice trembling. "I love being with Stephen, but it's hard to let go of Mark completely. He's a part of me, Mia." Mia, ever the voice of reason, sighed softly. "Cecile, Mark will always be a part of you, but you deserve to be happy again. You don't have to choose between your past and your future. Stephen isn't asking you to forget, is he?" "No," Cecile whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "He's not. But sometimes I feel like I'm betraying Mark by allowing myself to love someone else." Mia's words echoed in Cecile's mind long after their conversation ended. She knew Mia was right. She didn't have to choose between the love she had lost and the love she was finding. But the guilt lingered, threatening to overshadow the happiness she was beginning to feel with Stephen. Stephen, too, had been grappling with his own unresolved grief. Though he had opened his heart to Cecile, the pain of losing his father still hung over him like a dark cloud. For years, he had buried his emotions, believing that shutting them away would protect him from further pain. But with Cecile, he found himself wanting more, wanting to heal, to be the man she deserved. One day, as they walked hand in hand along a quiet beach, the tension between them became palpable. Cecile had been distant, lost in her thoughts, and Stephen could sense that something was weighing on her. He had noticed the way she seemed to retreat into herself, as though there was a wall between them that she couldn't break through. Finally, Stephen stopped walking and gently tugged on Cecile's hand, forcing her to look at him. "What's going on, Cecile? You've been so quiet lately." Cecile's heart raced as she met his concerned gaze. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding the conversation they needed to have. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, "I've been thinking about Mark, about how I'm moving on with you when I never thought I'd love anyone else again." Stephen's expression softened. He had expected this conversation at some point, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "Cecile, it's okay to still love him. I don't expect you to forget him or what you had together. But I need to know, are you ready to move forward with me? Can you open your heart to us?" Cecile's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to find the right words. "I want to, Stephen. I really do. But sometimes I feel like I'm betraying him by letting myself be happy with you." Stephen's heart ached at her words, but he understood her struggle. He had faced a similar battle with his own grief, constantly wondering if he was betraying his father's memory by allowing himself to embrace life again. He took a deep breath and reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not betraying him, Cecile. Loving me doesn't mean you love him any less. It just means you're allowing yourself to live again." Cecile sobbed quietly, the weight of her emotions finally spilling over. Stephen pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly mourn Mark while also acknowledging the new love she had found with Stephen. And as Stephen held her, he realized that he, too, needed to confront his own grief. They were both still healing, still navigating the pain of their pasts. But they were doing it together, and that made all the difference. As the weeks passed, Stephen and Cecile's relationship grew stronger. They had faced the shadows of their pasts and were learning to move forward together. But just as they began to find their rhythm, an unexpected event shook their fragile peace. One afternoon, while Cecile was at work, she received a message from an old acquaintance of Mark's family. Clarissa, Mark's cousin, was in town and wanted to meet. It had been years since Cecile had seen or spoken to anyone from Mark's family, and the sudden request left her feeling unsettled. She agreed to meet Clarissa at a small cafe, though her heart was heavy with anxiety. When she arrived, Clarissa greeted her warmly, though there was a tension in the air that Cecile couldn't ignore. "I'm glad you agreed to meet with me," Clarissa began, her tone polite but distant. "I wanted to talk to you about something important." Cecile's stomach churned with nervousness. "What is it, Clarissa?" Clarissa hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "Mark's parents, they've heard that you're seeing someone new. They're concerned that you've moved on so quickly, especially since it's only been a few years since Mark passed." Cecile felt the color drain from her face. She hadn't anticipated this, hadn't expected anyone to question her right to find happiness again. "It's been more than a few years, Clarissa," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I love Mark deeply, but I have to live my life." Clarissa's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of judgment in her eyes. "I understand that, Cecile, but his parents are struggling to accept that you've moved on. They're still grieving, and they feel like you've forgotten him." The words cut Cecile deeply, stirring up the guilt that had already been simmering beneath the surface. She hadn't forgotten Mark. She could never forget him. But did loving Stephen mean she was dishonoring his memory? Was she moving on too soon? "I haven't forgotten him," Cecile said firmly, though her voice wavered. "I'll always love Mark, but I can't live in the past forever. I deserve to be happy again." Clarissa nodded, though her expression remained conflicted. "I understand. I just wanted you to know how his parents feel." Cecile left the cafe feeling shaken and unsure of herself. The conversation had stirred up old wounds, making her question everything she had been trying to build with Stephen. She knew she loved him, but the guilt of moving on from Mark's memory weighed heavily on her heart. That evening, when she met with Stephen, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, concern etched in his features. Cecile hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened. "I met with Mark's cousin today," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His family, they're upset that I've moved on. They think I've forgotten him." Stephen's heart ached for Cecile. He could see the pain and guilt in her eyes, and it tore him apart to know that she was struggling with this. "Cecile," he said gently, taking her hand in his, "you haven't forgotten Mark. I know how much he meant to you, but you can't let his family's grief dictate how you live your life." Cecile nodded, though tears welled up in her eyes. "I know, but it's hard. I don't want to hurt them, and I don't want to dishonor Mark's memory. But I also don't want to lose you." Stephen cupped her face in his hands, his gaze intense. "You won't lose me. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. But you have to decide what's right for you. Don't let anyone else make that decision for you." Cecile's heart swelled with emotion as she looked into Stephen's eyes. She knew he was right. She couldn't let anyone else dictate how she lived her life or who she chose to love. But the guilt still lingered, a heavy weight on her chest that she couldn't quite shake. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult Cecile had ever faced. The conversation with Clarissa had left her feeling torn between her past and her present, unsure of how to move forward. But through it all, Stephen remained by her side, patient and understanding as she worked through her emotions. One evening, as they sat together on Cecile's porch, Stephen finally broached the subject that had been weighing on both of their minds. "I think we need to talk about what happens next," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with concern. Cecile's heart skipped a beat. She knew this conversation was coming, but she still wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. "What do you mean?" Stephen sighed, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the right words. "I love you, Cecile. I want to build a future with you. But I also know that you're still struggling with your feelings about Mark. And I need to know, can you move forward with me? Can you let yourself be happy with me without feeling guilty?" Cecile's breath caught in her throat as she listened to Stephen's words. She knew he was right. She couldn't keep holding on to the past if she wanted to build a future with him. But the guilt still clung to her, a constant reminder of the love she had lost. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to, Stephen. I really do. But it's hard. I feel like I'm betraying Mark by allowing myself to be happy with you." Stephen's heart ached at her words, but he remained patient. "You're not betraying him, Cecile. Loving me doesn't mean you love him any less. It just means you're allowing yourself to live again." Tears welled up in Cecile's eyes as she realized the truth in Stephen's words. She had been so focused on holding on to Mark's memory that she hadn't allowed herself to fully embrace the love she had found with Stephen. But now, as she sat beside him, she knew she had a choice to make. She could continue to let the past dictate her future, or she could let go of the guilt and allow herself to be happy with Stephen. It wasn't an easy decision, but as she looked into Stephen's eyes, she knew what she had to do. "I love you, Stephen," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And I want to move forward with you. I don't want to let my past hold me back anymore." Stephen's heart swelled with relief as he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I love you too, Cecile, and I'm so glad you're choosing us." In that moment, as they held each other close, Cecile felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Stephen by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges came their way. Together, they were ready to embrace the future, no longer held back by the shadows of their pasts. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.